You might not even, as a sales leader, be the best person at cold calling in your sales team, but I think you have to show that you're prepared to do it at times. One, to kind of get people following the lead, but also as a way for you to maybe set a standard as well.
Welcome to Coach the Sale, the podcast for sales professionals on the path to becoming sales leaders. Each week, we sit down with sales coaches, successful sales leaders, and others at the top of their game to share what they've learned and help you to coach the sale.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 5 of Coach the Sale. I'm your host, Matt Heyman, Marketing Manager here at Refract. Now, if you have a fear of cold calling, or you manage people who have a fear of cold calling or reluctant to pick up the phone, this is the episode for you. I'm speaking with Refract's very own head of sales, Rich Smith, and we're talking all about that thing that some people just cannot get over, the fear of cold calling. Rich shares a huge number of tips, tricks, and insights from his time working in sales both at Refract and in previous roles, and we're going to cover a huge range of topics in this half-hour show. In the episode, we cover how does a fear of cold calling actually manifest itself both within us and in the staff that we manage? What are some of the factors that increase and decrease that fear of cold calling? Rich shares how he got over his own cold call reluctance when he was starting out his sales career. He talks about leading from the front, creating a culture that embraces cold calling, and getting great fit hires right from the start, managing their expectations around cold calling so that you get the very best of those people that you manage. Huge number of tips and insights in this episode. Let's get started with Rich Smith from Refract. Rich, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I think what we should do is just start off by, if you can just introduce yourself a little bit, give us a bit of background on your career and what's led you to be a co-founder here at Refract.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in sales not too long in the grand scheme of things, coming up to about 10 years. I started in sales as an SDR, fresh out of university, and kind of worked my way up, I guess, in the chain at a previous software company. And when that company was acquired about 3 years ago, Kevin, the founder and CEO of Refract, kind of said, Rich, do you fancy coming along and helping me set this thing up? And leading on the sales side of things, I thought it was too much of a great opportunity to turn down, and started off with just the two of us, but now we're a company of 20 odd employees, and learned a hell of a lot in that past 3 years too along the way.
So we're not going to talk too much about the product specifically because the website does that, but I am interested in what you and Kevin saw as the perceived problem that led you to create this software solution. What was the problem that you guys saw in sales that led you to think, how can we solve this for our customers?
I think so much of it was born from our own experiences, and if I look at it on a personal level, it's fair to say that in my early stage sales career, the amount of personal development I got was limited at best. It was probably a very similar situation. How a lot of salespeople kind of learn, just by almost doing the job and making mistakes, sometimes not knowing are the mistakes I'm making, are they actually mistakes? What am I doing well? Really, the problem was never really had that consistent exposure to getting feedback from somebody who was more senior and more experienced. The coaching that I got was really restricted to kind of what I would describe as back of a taxi feedback after a meeting. That kind of 5-minute journey back to the train station, getting that sort of debrief from my manager, or even the problem was, even when I did sales calls and demos and an inside sales function, a lot of those calls and demos were happening essentially behind closed doors and meeting rooms, meeting booths. Nobody ever really got the chance to listen to how I sold and give me recommendations on how I can improve. So it felt like there was a better way here, and thankfully my situation is very similar to thousands of others globally, where the amount of personal development they receive is limited at best, and part of that is, in my opinion, In order to actually help salespeople improve, the first stage is observing what they're doing today, and Refract essentially provides a vehicle to observe how salespeople are selling in practice, and then using technology and tools to really start to take people to the next level.
One of the things that you and I spoke about when we were planning topics for this episode was the idea of the cold call, and often how fearful people can be of making those types of calls. How do you see the problem? How do you see other people experience this fear of cold calling?
First of all, there's no getting away from it. Cold calling is a daunting experience for pretty much any sales professional out there. I'd be lying if I said, my first cold calls of the day, as somebody who's been doing for some time, the first one of the day is always almost the hardest one to do. It's not easy. There's a lot of salespeople who have never really done cold calling, and part of that is because it's completely out of their comfort zone. In my opinion, I think if you can become accomplished at cold calling, then you really set yourself up for success for the rest of your career. And there is genuine reason why cold calling is daunting. It's first and foremost, it's an interruption to somebody's day, somebody who doesn't have a clue who you are, who your product is, why you're calling them. And you've just rang them out of the blue, and from going from somebody not expecting your call, not knowing who you are, to then getting that person to want to give you more of their time feels quite a daunting task. And I think ultimately that's where it stems from. The foundations of why people have fears over cold calling is fearing that they are an interruption, and they're almost a thorn in the side of the people that they're looking to call. And I think coupled with that, the fact that they have such a short window of opportunity to make that cold call a success, just adds to that pressure. And I think there's maybe an element of cold calling in that it's long been seen as this high volume activity game, and can be, in that sense, quite mind numbing. You could sit there and you could make 60, 70 dials and have nothing to show for it at the end of it. Yet, from my experience, whilst the cold calling is still a numbers game to some extent, so much of what you can do with cold calling is actually increasing your chances of success. But yeah, I think ultimately the fear and the anxiety around cold calling primarily stems from just being that interruption and making sure that you're making the most of the person's time when they actually answer the phone.
So I want to come back to some of the reasons why people might find it a daunting prospect, but before we do that, maybe let's take a step back and actually define the cold call. When you talk about cold calling, are you talking about calling somebody up with no prior interaction, or maybe they've downloaded some collateral from a website? How do you define the cold call?
In my opinion, a cold call is calling somebody on the telephone who has little to no idea of who you are or who your company is, who isn't expecting your call. So I've often heard cold calls being described as with a correlation of somebody who has an element of expectation of the call. But in my opinion, a cold call is exactly that. It's somebody who you haven't spoken to before, who wasn't expecting your call, who doesn't really know who you are or much about your company, and that is my definition of a cold call.
So let's jump back to that some of those reasons why people might be reluctant or reticent to do a cold call. You mentioned sort of them thinking of it as an interruption, but talk about some of the other factors that may sort of exacerbate that. I'm thinking in particular of maybe people who are self-conscious about being overheard on the phone or being criticised by colleagues, or give me a sense of, like, in terms of the hierarchy of the things that make it even worse for people. What are some of those top 3, top 5?
Well, I've seen this firsthand. I remember when I started my career in sales, I was pretty much the only person in my sales team at the time who would cold call. I'd never done the job before. I had very little sales experience. I didn't really know what to say when I made the call. I kind of just took myself in the deep end. However, there was, if you imagine as an individual salesperson in quite a quiet office, not a lot of background noise, sat on a sales desk with others around you, feeling unsure about, am I going to say the right thing? What happens if they hang up on me? What if I muddle my words? The whole concept of being in that quiet environment, thinking that everybody's listening to your calls, just kind of adds to the anxiety. And I've kind of seen this before when we started building the sales team at Refract. There were times when we were a smaller company, we didn't have many, we had a much smaller sales team. Those same concerns of people essentially feeling like people are eavesdropping into your conversation is something that can really hold salespeople back. So I think there is that mental block that a lot of people have, especially in quiet or close-knit office environments, feeling that they're very self-conscious about how they sound on the phone, and also they maybe a sense of anxiety of embarrassment if they get hung up on by a prospect, and feeling that everybody knows that happened.
Were there times in your career where you were new to cold calling and you had that reluctance, or have you always been prepared to pick up the phone, not necessarily hampered by any of the things we've spoken about? What's been your take over the years with cold calling?
I've definitely had cold call reluctance in my life. I think particularly in those early days, not necessarily at Refract, but when I was kind of learning the ropes, and maybe in sales environments that didn't really have that kind of really culture mindset of really solid prospecting. And there were mornings when I'd walk in, and the thought of making a cold call at 9 o'clock in the morning in a quiet office just was almost petrifying. But I think over time, I kind of removed that mental block from my head, and I think for a lot of salespeople who are feeling the same thing about cold calling, that same kind of, they look and stare at the phone for the first hour of the day, just kind of trying to psych themselves up or to pick it up. It is a mental block, and there is things that I think can be done for sure that can really help to remove that mental block, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But part of it that is the kind of the cold hard reality of sales is sometimes with mental blocks, it is just about getting over it, facing your fear ultimately, and saying, I'm never actually going to get over this fear until I just do it, and that's the reality.
So on an individual level, we'll come on to culture later, and how as a sales leader you can foster within the team a greater acceptance and greater enthusiasm for cold calling. But on an individual level then, how did you get over some of those initial roadblocks, those things that held you back from making that initial call first thing?
Yeah, so some things I did was choosing maybe the times that I did cold calling. The reality is nobody really wants to make cold calls at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. People are still warming up. As any salesperson, we warm up during the day. Once we start talking more, we start getting our head in the game more. And so it was maybe a switch to prospecting at times of the day when the office was there was a bit more of a buzz in the office, and feeling that myself, I kind of warmed up the vocal cords, if you like, as just any sportsman would do in their stretches, and getting over the rustiness, and kind of getting into the swing of things later on. I think as well, a big part of what I did was really trying to optimize the cold calls I did. So rather than just calling blindly number after number, feeling that I had a relevant opening statement to use with prospects. And I quickly learned that you don't need to make 70 cold calls before you get one meeting on. You can become more effective in what you're saying to increase your chances, where you could make 10 dials and you could end up getting one meeting out of those 10 dials because you have one conversation and you know how to nail that conversation. And then as well, just little things like putting music on in the office just to create more of a background noise. It sounds quite simple, but it really helps just to provide, removes that kind of deathly hallowed silence from the office, and just provides something a bit more comforting as you're actually making calls.
So then talk about culture as well, because if you're responsible for a team of sales professionals, how do you lead from the front when it comes to maybe identifying somebody who's really strong at sales, but maybe there's a bit of reluctance there around the cold call? How do you engender a culture where that enthusiasm that you have is shared amongst the team?
Well, for me, one of my big principles is leading from the front. I think if you're a sales leader and you're demanding your team to make cold calls, which is daunting, is hard, if you can't show that you're prepared to do it too, then people won't necessarily follow suit. People will think. I think I'm a big believer that as a leader, you set an example. You might not even, as a sales leader, be the best person at cold calling in your sales team, but I think you have to show that you're prepared to do it at times. One, to kind of get people following the lead, but also as a way for you to maybe set a standard as well. I think as well, for me, a lot of it stems from the outset when you hire somebody on. I think there's a lot of expectations that you can set around what the culture to, for example, prospecting is. I think a lot of salespeople, when they're hired, they need to understand that is part of their routine, and if they have total fears and concerns of cold calling in a company that has that as part of their prospecting mix, then they may want to question whether they are the right fit for that company as a starting point. So that's one of the things that we actually measure for when we recruit here at Refract. Is we do physical exercises based around things like cold calling to really see if someone is comfortable doing it.
And I had a conversation with one of the SDRs here at Refract earlier today on exactly that subject, and what she said to me was how refreshing it was in that role play, in that sort of preparation, was to not role play an entire call, but to role play segments of it, like the open of a cold call, for example, is a good way to do that. That's something that you and Kevin in particular have consciously thought to implement over time. Have you found that to be a successful way of doing it, of honing in on isolated components and then help having the SDR or prospective SDR run through that with you?
Yeah, for sure. There is, even though cold calls are traditionally very short conversations, you kind of might question, well, how many facets to a cold call really are there? Well, actually, when you break them down, you could have a 2-minute long cold call that could be made up of 5 or 6 or 7 individual attributes which you can coach around. So that could range from the very first thing that you say on a call, the opening gambit, as I say. It could be on the first question. It could be working on pauses, which are so crucial to success in cold calls. It could be understanding how to handle objections. It could be around knowing the specific moment in a call when to try and close someone for a meeting. There are so many facets which to try and coach all of those in one go into an individual is very difficult. It's not as easy as saying, let's just practice cold calls. When you break it down into those segments, and almost the way I think about it, it's almost like piecing together the perfect jigsaw. And that's where tools like Refract have been really powerful, because you can share literally 5 seconds of a cold call with somebody else in the team, because that was the part of the call that they need to improve and tune up on. So definitely, I think coaching in breaking things down to bite-sized chunks, especially for young, inexperienced salespeople who are trying to learn the ropes, is key to just really refining and practicing those skills.
So I want to come back to overcoming the fear of cold calling, because I think ultimately that's what people are going to be listening out for on this episode in particular. Are there any specific tips? You mentioned about sort of embracing it and almost taking that leap of faith and making that first call, but are there any other tips that you would give somebody who shares that fear of cold calling, but is still reluctant to do it?
Yeah, there's a number of things I can think of here. So first of all, if you work with other salespeople, I come back to this facet of it's called the silent sales floor, is how it's being kind of named, and a lot of it comes from the kind of the quiet offices. Encourage, if you work as part of a sales team, get other people to make cold calls at the same time as you. Like everybody on the phone, making dials, having conversations, not just creates like general background noise, which kind of makes people feel less self-conscious about how they sound. It also just creates an amazing buzz in the office, an amazing energy as well, and just really encourages people to keep on going. Secondly, one thing that we've done at Refract, which I've wrote about, is creating days that are completely dedicated to cold calling. We call these hardcore prospecting days, but ultimately it's where everybody on the sales team, no matter what your job function or role is, comes in and makes calls together. But the idea is making an element of like gamifying the day as well. So we have things like, building in prospecting battleships, play your cards right, all these little games which foster just a culture of people wanting to do more activity, wanting to turn something which is traditionally seen as quite a mind-numbing activity and something that's actually quite fun and energetic. And then finally, I encourage practice and review. Nobody becomes good at cold calls overnight. It's probably took me 5 or 6 years before I thought I was really effective doing it. Practice through Roleplay, recording calls, listen back to them, get other people to give feedback. Listen to what your other colleagues are doing, and try and pick up on the things that they do well or things that they could improve on. Nobody ever gets good by not practicing, and unless you have that culture of practice, experiment, feedback, repeat, like you'll never ever improve. So I'd say all those things really foster a culture of more positivity and less anxiety when it comes to cold calling.
So we've had Dan Jordan on the podcast. Dan is a very high energy guy. He's based in the States. Refract is a UK company with customers around the world. But Dan is very high energy. Give me your take on how that initial cold call should be approached. Is energy, is enthusiasm good? Is there an upper ceiling to it where it becomes too much? What's your take on how you approach that call in your own mind and how you come across?
Yeah, well, a little story. I remember just very recently, as someone who leads the sales team but still does like cold calling and prospecting when I have time available. I remember doing a cold call recently, and I almost felt as I was doing it, I almost was boring myself the way I sounded, and I knew I was doing it. It was just one of those days, and lo and behold, the call went absolutely nowhere. And I just thought at the end of it, I was like, there was no way that prospect was ever going to want to give me any more of their time, because I just sound like I haven't enthused them at all just by sounding just not enough energy in my voice. So I think definitely prospects can resonate from your energy that they get down the phone. I think there is maybe a ceiling there. I think like you don't want to maybe be too over the top, because I think that might sometimes be construed as you're being like you're kind of the typical pushy over the top salesperson. But I think certainly having some level of energy and sprightliness in your voice is key. I think as well, just trying to sound natural. I think why we have so much success here at Refract is because everybody just sounds so natural when they're doing the phone. We're not following scripts or anything like that. We're just we're trying to make even a cold call a conversation. So yeah, I think there are definitely some facets into how you sound on the phone is definitely important. But again, none of that is measurable until you listen back, like I did, and have that kind of second perspective, because sometimes how we think we sound on the phone is very different to the reality.
So in terms of how cold calling culture can have a positive and negative impact on a business, give me your perspective on where it can go, both on a negative side and on a positive side, in terms of if a business is doing cold calling and doing it well, where can that take them?
Well, I think we've all became so utterly bored of the ongoing debate online that's been around for ages around, is cold calling dead? From our perspective, the reason that we embrace it so much is because it works. We have conversations with the prospects we want to speak to. We book appointments. They turn into business. For us, for me, that's the pure evidence of why cold calling is still very much alive. And actually, I think on a wider perspective, so few sales teams are cold calling, and they've become too reliant on sending emails or sending LinkedIn messages, and what it's contributed to is just too much noise in those arenas, and as a result, they're kind of missing a trick. I could count on one hand the number of cold calls I've received from salespeople in the past 3 years, and that's the genuine truth. But ask me how many emails I've received, and the number is enormous. And I think a lot of it again comes down to the fact that maybe people have a misconception around how cold calling is received by prospects, but also a feeling that they have had it hammered into them that cold calling is dead. And for me, long may it continue for people to continue saying that, because that just means that it's easy for companies like us to really to break through the noise and stand out. I think going back to the other side of what the negatives of cold calling could be, I think really it comes down to whether you do it effectively or not. I think you can be incredibly ineffective at cold calling and find that you literally waste as a salesperson, as a sales team, hours and hours and really have not a lot of return on your investment. And I think with anything to do with prospecting, the best approach is a blended approach. It's using all the tools available to you, knowing your audience. Some prospects respond better to certain methods of outreach than others. But certainly, just as it is a waste of time to send hundreds of generic templated emails, the same can be said for making hundreds of dials and not being effective at having that conversation. Part of that as well is quite crucial that we've found is having the right data, and we use some brilliant tools like ZoomInfo that we've been a customer for a couple of years as one example, who provide like direct dials, which is transformative in relation to not navigating gatekeepers, getting through to prospects, increasing connectivity rates, and not wasting time hitting switchboards and hitting people who will never put you through to the people that you want to speak to.
In terms of touch points, cold calling is sometimes seen in isolation. The call happens, there's no follow-up. What's your take on what does a typical cadence look like? Even if there is a typical cadence, does it involve just calling? Does it involve calling an email? Is it blended? Give the listeners a little bit of insight into how you see it working. Does it work by itself, or should it be used as part of a blended approach? And what might that start to look like for some other businesses?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I don't particularly feel I've got the magic bullet here. My philosophy on touch points and follow-ups is follow up sensibly with regularity, but don't go over the top. I think too often I see salespeople going over the top with the follow-ups. They're 10 plus touch points. But I think where they often fall down is most of those touch points tend to be the same method. It's like 10 emails, one after the other. And by the second, you're completely bored of receiving them, and there's probably a reason why you didn't respond to the first one anyway. But that's a bit of a side topic. And so I think having a cadence which includes multiple touch points, whether that's phone first, email second, social third. A lot of people are starting to get into writing handwritten notes as part of their cadence. But I think when it comes to phone, the phone part of that cadence, key to it has to be around the time of day that you're making the calls. I think is quite key. We have to become smart at understanding when we can best catch our prospects, and often that's first thing in the morning or lunchtime, or even later on the day when people tend to be at their desks more or not head down into their day job. So I think follow up sensibly, follow up diligently, but I think as salespeople we need to understand when no response typically means there's no point wasting more time in that prospect.
You've already shared an example of a time when you yourself said that you felt bored on a call, and you weren't surprised when the prospect was bored. Let's look at the opposite of that. Let's look at the reverse. Can you think of a time or share a time when you were maybe hesitant about going into a cold call, but it ended up going very well?
Yeah, pretty much every time I make one. I think there's always that level of uncertainty. I think just like funny things with salespeople, I'm sure this will resonate to lots of people. Where you can look a prospect up on LinkedIn that you're going to prospect, and you suddenly make weird judgments in your head that this person looks a particularly scary person, or this person's got VP in their title. Ooh, I'm a bit nervous calling them. We make these weird, again, they're just ultimately mental blocks about just the look of the person or the job title, and just feeling that's going to change the dynamic of the conversation. And so I was in that boat. I used to be in that boat. I used to, anybody that had a really senior job title, I used to, get more anxious about calling that person. But again, it's just I think it's a facet where you just have to kind of laugh it off and think that's just silly. And one method I used to do is I used to put together a calling list, but I wouldn't put their job title on that list. I just have the name of the person, the company. So to kind of like, I knew that they were they fitted the profile of person I wanted to talk to. I knew what they were called and what the company they worked for, but that mental block of seeing their really senior, big, flashy job title was just removed from my vision. So I think to me that kind of springs to mind as like things that I think often we feel that this is going to be a more dangerous cold call, but things that are pretty meaningless at the end of the day.
Excellent. So last question to wrap things up then. Top 3 tips. What are the top 3 tips that you would recommend somebody follow if they are currently in a position where they fear cold calling, or they're managing a team of people who they know are fearful of cold calling? What would be the top 3 tips that you would give somebody in that situation?
From a management perspective, I'd start with address it full on with the team. I've had conversations with salespeople before where I address the fear of cold calling before they've experienced it, kind of before they get to that stage of staring at the phone and not wanting to pick it up, of me saying, listen, this is a very real thing. It affects so many salespeople. I understand firsthand the challenges and how daunting it can be and the reasons why it can be daunting. And just kind of getting people appreciative of the fact that I, as a sales leader, understand and appreciate the anxiety that people have over it. I think is a great way just to get salespeople on your side and almost starting to overcome that fear before they've actually got it. Secondly, I really think having a team of people who are doing it at the same time and having that culture that everybody can just be on the phone at the same time is so crucial. That also provides opportunities for instant feedback. You've just came off a bad cold call. You can ask the person next to you can ask you, what happened, what went wrong. And you can even review the call afterwards as well. Just having that shared experiences of people all in it together. And the third one is a great call opening that we use here at Refract without giving away the company secrets. The opening line to use in the call, which never fails to let us down. Hi Matt, it's Richard from Refract. Have you got 23 seconds so I can tell you what I've called today? We often 9 times out of 10 get very positive responses. So there's my secret sauce.
Rich, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate those. Some great tips in there as well.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Coach the Sale. For show notes, sales coaching resources, and more, visit Refract.ai/coach.